Welcome to the People's Webinar, Teaching Beyond Fear. I'm Greg Wickenkamp, a former public school teacher and proud member of Iowa's Graduate Worker Union, COGS, UE Local 896. If you're tuning in, you already know that we're facing some of the worst legislation we've seen in a generation. This webinar is specifically about those laws that aim to outlaw teaching and practices around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in higher ed. Iowa is unfortunately a leader on this regressive front. Laws that pushed me out of the K-12 classroom have now made their way to Iowa's universities, and these segregationist laws depend in part on vague language. We hope this webinar offers some clarity and context and answers your questions. Several organizations across the state decided to put together this People's Webinar to answer questions that you have. On behalf of the sponsoring organizations, I interviewed 3 people with really incredible insights. The first is a graduate student who shares a story of how she stood up to the University of Iowa when it sought to intimidate her for her scholarly work on diversity, equity, and inclusion. The second is a licensed attorney and the author of the 2024 Iowa Manual on Civil Procedure. He'll answer questions submitted by students, staff, and faculty from across the state. Finally, we'll hear from a leader of the 1960s civil rights movement, a SNCC veteran who helped organize the 1963 March on Washington. And he's going to weigh in on how Iowa's laws are cut from the very same cloth as those that the civil rights movement was fighting against. I found these interviews inspiring and think you will too. Following that, stick around for a chance to ask your own questions to Henry Hamilton, and feel free throughout to use the chat to share questions, thoughts, or resources with one another. On behalf of the sponsoring organizations, those are UE Local 896 COGS, the Great Plains Action Society, Corridor Community Action Network, Annie's Voice for Change, Public Space One, Antelope Lending Library, and the Cross-Cultural Student Coalition at the University of Iowa, I'm really honored to introduce the first guest. Marie Krebs is a graduate student at the University of Iowa. She's working on a master's in social work. After presenting at a conference, she received a threatening letter from the University of Iowa demanding she turn over all her presentation material or risk being expelled. Marie shares the remarkable story of what happened next. Krebs is the managing director for the Great Plains Action Society. That's an indigenous-led grassroots organization fighting colonial capitalism and empowering indigenous communities. A mother and grandmother, she enjoys music, dancing, spending time with family and friends. Her passion is healing within Native communities through honesty, compassion, self-awareness, accountability, and integrity, while supporting each person's autonomy to walk their own path. Marie Krebs, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, so I'm here to share my story about living in the state of Iowa as a BIPOC person and attending a university. I am a master's student with the School of Social Work. I had a professor share that there was an opportunity coming up, a national conference, CSWE, which is the Council of Social Work Education. They are our School of Social Work and many School of Social Work's accrediting body. Were putting together a national conference. The theme of the conference was Indigenous Knowledge, Sovereignty, Environmental Justice, Act Now. So when I heard about the conference, I was super excited. I was immediately making plans to go. And then the professor also pushed our class to submit proposals to present at this conference. So me and another student submitted a proposal, and we wanted to talk about anti-DEI legislation from a BIPOC student's perspective. We were accepted. We went in October to this conference. We presented, and to be honest, we did a critique on the School of Social Work and accreditation, and just highlighted the disconnect that we were seeing because we're bound by social work ethics, which include social justice, and we also are bound by our accreditation standards, which include anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion specifically. So we should be standing on business despite legislation coming through. However, from our perspective, the university was complicit and not even necessarily fighting back, but not even from my perspective, making a statement or supporting us as BIPOC students. So it was very disappointing. And we talked about it, and we talked about it in a professional manner, because as social workers, we should be able to have these discussions as adults. And we did approach it just stating that we're students. I'm not a faculty member. I'm not an administration member. So, this is my perspective, and we invite conversation. So we had great feedback. A lot of our director was there, the director for the School of Social Work, and many faculty members had lots of great feedback. However, as soon as I get back from this conference, I started receiving correspondence from the director asking questions about our presentation. And we were asking, what is this all about? At one point, we were reprimanded for using a public podcast, actually the School of Social Work's public podcast, ironically, in this presentation, to which we still pushed back and said, hey, this is a public podcast, please explain more where this is coming from. And we did not receive an answer. We received demands for our presentation to be submitted. To which I would not do. I would like an explanation. And there was a lot of back and forth. Eventually, I simply said, please provide something, or just quit harassing me. Because at this point, it really felt like harassment. I'm trying to do my schoolwork, and I'm getting constant emails. So it went up the chain. They sent me, a letter that stated policies. It didn't make any sense to me. They basically said, so long story short, they basically wanted to see our presentation because they wanted to know if we aligned the school or its employees, like politically, did we align them with any sort of political party or something along that line, which I thought was odd, because I don't think that we did. And I think it was, I felt concerned because we were talking about anti-DEI legislation, in which Iowa has some of the strictest anti-DEI legislation that was just recently passed. So, we didn't have a conversation. It was basically just send us your stuff, and I refused. So what it all boiled down to was I received a mark in my record for 2 months or 2 semesters, and I received a letter that stated that it was the failure to comply with directives. So it's a great honor. I definitely did not comply, and I encourage other folks to not comply to the best of their capacity, because I didn't feel that this was something that I felt in my spirit and in my, according to, I guess, my level of integrity that I wanted to comply with. So that's pretty much it. And now I'm actually leaving the school because of all of this. We're seeing massive dismantling of all of our cultural programs, and I can't in good conscience stay there and, provide thousands of dollars to support that.
Wow. Yeah. So to recap, you were doing a conference that you applied and were granted admission to. You were talking about anti-DEI legislation from your own personal position as a graduate student. And for that, the university hounded you, asked to see all your materials, made threats about all sorts of things, kicking you out of the college, but you held firm.
The letter stated if I did not turn over my intellectual property by, a certain date and time, I will be faced with, up to expulsion.
And you had not taken funding from the school to go to this conference. Is that right?
I did not. So to be honest, they, so this professor who had been platforming students, had been really working to get support from the school for us. And she did bring it to our attention, like, hey, submit, things, and the school social work will be willing to fund you. So I did. However, that was part of the letter specifically stated. So the way I interpreted it was, because we funded you, we own your presentation. So just to be clear, they had not funded me at that time. It was still in the process. But once I read that, I said, no, thank you. Yeah. I work for Great Plains Action Society. It's an Indigenous organization, grassroots organization. I was going to this conference as an Indigenous person, and I was lucky they refunded, my expenses. So, which, would have been the plan from the get-go. However, I was really excited that the school was supporting us. And so, I was like, hey, that's great.
Yeah.
It was from my perspective, it felt like a weapon used against me. So I was like, I'm good.
Sounds like it. Wow.
Yeah.
And so when you started getting these letters threatening expulsion, did you have anybody that you turned to, or how did that? Must have been very scary, right?
It was scary. At the same time, I really felt like they're like, these people have a lot of audacity. That's honestly how I felt. Honestly, I wasn't scared to be kicked out of school. I can find another school, so that didn't scare me so much as, can they cause problems for me to get into another school? Can they, because this is a powerful university, and I have spoken with others who have stood up and have had the, been, from what it sounds like, kind of labeled as a troublemaker. So I didn't know how this would affect my career as a whole. However, I felt that I had to stand on my integrity and do what I felt was right. And if I guess for me, this was a bigger picture. So if I let them bully me, they're going to think they can bully everyone. And honestly, the way things kind of fell, I feel like they're used to just kind of pushing people around. And I was one of the few who stood up, and they didn't even know what to do with it, because they went from the strongly worded letter up to expulsion to, you're going to meet with somebody, and at most you'll get a mark on your record, So the thing that is irritating, however, is they wasted so much of my time. And it was stressful. At times it was really stressful, because I didn't know how far it would go, because I had planned to stick it out. I didn't know how bad it would get, if they would target me. I had no idea how it was going to unfold. So that was stressful.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for standing firm in your integrity. I think if more of us do that, and more of us do that collectively, we can hold the line against these folks who want to ban diversity.
Yeah. And I have to say, I'm really lucky in a sense that I have a strong support system. I have an excellent community. They're the union for the university, graduate workers.
Yeah, the campaign to organize graduate students, UE Local 896. Yeah, so they were able to support you.
They were fantastic. They really, really gave me a strong foundation. They were willing to go with me to my meetings, so I'm not alone, and there's someone there to witness, the occurrences. Great Plains Action Society is amazing. Not only did they support me financially, the executive director, Kyle Snobus, was at my meeting when I had to meet with the investigator, and supported me through many things. And then I just am really lucky. I know amazing, amazing people. So I have a great crew that I can talk to, bounce ideas off of, people that I trust to, offer guidance. And honestly, just many people like within the activism community. There was legal counsel. I had like 3 different people that I talked to for legal without paying a dime. So I am truly, truly blessed in that way.
Wow. Yeah, that's extraordinary. I think sometimes when we feel alone, we don't realize that there are people there, like graduate worker unions or unions that are there to help. So
Yeah.
thank you for first.
And I just want to make it very clear that it's doing things like I didn't do this alone. I did this in community.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we're going to have to do moving forward, those of us who want to preserve diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility and moving forward. So thank you so much, Marie Krebs, for sharing your story with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Next up is Henry Hamilton III. He will be answering questions submitted by students, staff, and faculty from Iowa's Regents universities about how these laws affect them. Mr. Hamilton is a civil rights activist, a licensed attorney, and author of the 2024 Iowa Manual on Civil Procedure.
Henry Hamilton III comes to us today as a private citizen, speaking on an issue of public concern. The views and opinions are his own and should not be interpreted as the views or opinions of any past, present, or future employer or organization. Mr. Hamilton, thank you so much for being part of this forum.
Sure, thank you.
So these questions, again, submitted from a variety of students, staff, and faculty. I'll read them off. Before we get into SF 2435, that's the law that affects DEI programming in higher ed, what can you tell us about the context of this law? Was it passed in isolation?
Well, thanks for having me on, inviting me to talk about these issues. Yeah, this is actually a good place to start the conversation. No, this law was not passed in isolation, and we make a huge mistake if we look at these laws in isolation. We talked about this before in Iowa. At this time, we're experiencing perhaps the most appalling attack on the rights of African Americans, immigrants, and members of the LGBTQ plus community than we've seen in 100 years or more. And even before, House File 2435 that we're going to discuss today, I was passed a lot of, for lack of better words, legislation that some people deem questionable. And these acts may not have been wholly applicable to colleges and universities, but it's still part of this pattern that we've seen to rewrite history, to undo civil rights advantages and advances, or to force this view that America's success or Iowa's success is largely the product of one race or one sex, which is just not true. And to mind comes a House File 802, passed a few years ago, which restricts, I don't need to tell you this, which restricts the teaching of African American history in our schools. Last year we had Senate File 2385 that stripped the Iowa Civil Rights Commission of most authority to protect civil rights and concentrates the power of civil rights enforcement in a government-appointed director in the Office of Civil Rights. It eliminated several commissions that were put in place to support those communities in Iowa that have been systemically marginalized or discriminated against in the past. Gone is the Commission on the Status of African Americans, Commission on Asian and Pacific Islanders. Gone is the Commission on the Status of Women, Commission on Persons with Disabilities, Commission of Native American Affairs and Latino Affairs. And instead of these groups, it places all these mechanisms in the authority of a single Human Rights Board. We also had Senate File 496, which was controversial, which banned books referencing LGBTQ plus topics and restricted gender and sexuality instructions in our grade schools and high schools. So no, we can't view this in isolation. And I talk about these laws that have been passed within the last few years in this pattern that we see developing, but we really can't give too much credit to Iowa's leaders. Scholars are observing and commenting that this type of legislation doesn't, rise in the typical legislative fashion. It's not like folks are going to town hall meetings, hearing from their constituents and going back to their offices and typing up legislation. Many people view, Iowa as almost a pass-through entity to pass legislation that has been created by probably some of the nation's most extreme groups. And a lot of this legislation is just put forth without any amendments or discussions. And, and Iowa's not alone. If you look at Senate File 2435, it's similar to legislation in Mississippi. Senate Bill 2223, nearly word for word. But in Mississippi, strangely, it's not likely to pass. It did not pass last year. A related bill passed. And so you can even make the argument, at least when it comes to this type of legislation, that Mississippi is apparently more progressive than Iowa.
Wow.
We have a situation where educators at the University of Mississippi and Southern Mississippi, the University of Southern Mississippi, may have more freedom to discuss race and color discrimination than educators at Iowa State, UNI, or the University of Iowa. And of course, those of you who recall history, as people are saying, know that this is quite striking, since at the University of Mississippi, they didn't even allow their first African-American student until 1962, and the University of Southern Mississippi, I believe, until 1965. And so you can see how times have changed. But also, we make a mistake. Folks are saying that a mistake can be made from the opposition viewing these laws in isolation as well. There's the belief that this rather myopic strategy or approach has allowed these laws to experience greater success than they otherwise would have. And I believe what they're getting at is that the opponents of these laws tend to work in silos. And some examples that have come up is like when there's laws restricting the teaching of Black history or banning books from Black children, is there support from the immigrant and the LGBTQ plus community? When there's laws attacking immigrants' rights, is there support from the African American and LGBTQ plus community? And you get the picture when there's laws attacking the LGBTQ plus community. Is there support from the African American community or the immigrant community? And scholars would tell you that this just isn't an effective approach, and is highly problematic to view these issues in isolation.
Thank you. I think that is really vital context. I appreciate your offering it. I'm wondering, regarding SF 2435 and the Board of Regents guidance around it, what is this law? What does it mean for those of us at universities in Iowa?
In a nutshell, it appears that the law prevents the three state universities. So you have Iowa State University, University of Northern Iowa, and of course, University of Iowa, from maintaining or funding DEI offices, and prevents them from creating new ones. It's codified at Iowa Code 2261J.1, and the first section defines what we mean when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it has been defined as any effort, and I'm going to read this here, as any effort to influence the composition of the faculty or student body with regard to race, sex, color, or ethnicity, any effort to promote differential treatment of individuals, any effort to promote policies and procedures designed or implemented with reference to race, color, or ethnicity, any effort to promote trainings or activities designed or implemented with reference to race, color, ethnicity, gender identity, or sexual orientation. One of the more troubling, well, I shouldn't say it more, one of the more troubling sections people are saying is this one section that, and I'll read this verbatim, any effort to promote as the official position of the public institution of higher education a particular widely contested opinion referencing unconscious or implicit bias, cultural appropriation, allyship, transgender ideology, microaggressions, group marginalization, anti-racism, systemic oppression, social justice, and it goes on. And this is, I think, where people are seeing the difficulties with the law rises. First, it actually targets a very small subset of university employees. And I'm not sure how many people go around purporting to speak for an institution. And as you know, we definitely wouldn't recommend that unless you're the president of the university or you have conferred with the president. I just don't think people go around giving speeches asserting that they have authority to speak on behalf of these three universities.
Right.
But, and if they do, they need to stop it, of course. So that's be my opinion. But even as applied to this small universe of employees, people are saying a court could find that these laws are unconstitutional in that they're void for vagueness. And what I mean by that is the 14th Amendment due process gives us a right to be free from laws that are so vague that a person of ordinary intelligence does not have fair notice of what is prohibited. And in Iowa, the courts have held that a statute is unconstitutionally vague if it fails to provide adequate notice of the prescribed conduct and lends itself to arbitrary enforcement. And so if you go back to the language that I talked about, particularly where it says a particular widely contested opinion, I don't know if that's clear on its face what's prohibited. And like a particular, I mean, well, I don't know how you determine that. Widely contested opinion. Okay, so there's people that say in their minds that raises the question, widely contested by whom? By the speaker, by the listener, by freshman students, sophomore students, parents, janitors, professors, the Manhattan Institute, white nationalists, extremists. There's who widely contested by whom, and so that will be an answer as this proceeds up through the court. And then it prohibits a qualifying entity from promoting these widely contested opinions, but it's one could say that it puts the administrators in a catch-22 when you're talking about widely contested, because if you say you're for racism, that the official policy of the school or the department is for racism, then of course that's going to be widely contested. That's a widely contested opinion. If you say the school, university department is works to eliminate racism, well, that could also be a widely contested opinion. If you say the official policy is that the school takes no stance, or whether it's for or against racism, that's also a widely contested opinion. And you see where I'm going with this? And then widely is that we talking 10% of the universe that they're referring to, 20%, 30%? And I think that's one of the flaws that a court might point out in the future. And of course, this comes from being, a pass-through entity. Was this law even scrutinized? And did anyone ask those questions? I think sometimes you can become so invested in an issue many people saying the issue is, turning back the clock on civil rights, that you might lose your ability to think clearly and ask these sort of questions.
Yeah, I think that offers a lot of clarity. When we get into the classroom, I think because of this perhaps purposeful vagueness, there's a lot of confusion about what's outlawed, what is allowed, especially for faculty, teaching assistants, and other staff, instructors. I'm wondering if I can kind of list off a number of questions we've had submitted, and you might offer clarity around those in the classroom. The first is, can teaching assistants still discuss intersectionality, for example, in a history course where it's relevant?
Well, let me discuss this broadly first, and then narrow it down to those specific questions. And I just talked about how because of some of these alleged failings in the law, and these are significant failings, it's hard to interpret what is and what is not expected. These laws are clearly there's a movement to give less deference to the trained educators. If you believe that it's the business of a university to provide a learning environment that's most conducive to its students, we're seeing interference in that. More and more, even across the country, people are saying that more and more legislators are trying to dictate what may be taught, how it should be taught, who can be admitted to the schools, and it creates problems. And so when one looks at these, it's so vague, it's hard to give directions, but I think we can scrutinize the language and give some directions. First of all, it doesn't really apply to the individual that's teaching. That's likely what a court would hold, that it applies to the university. And so I don't observe anything in the law that would prohibit teaching assistants from discussing intersectionality in a history course.
Thank you for that general overview too. Another question we had is, can librarians still make library resources related to DEI available, even if they don't contribute to a specific course, but are aimed at sort of general knowledge in a given field?
That's also a good question. Clearly, if they contribute to a specific field or a particular course, I think that's written into the law. I think it is a gray area whether it can be read as promoting one of those, the items I read before, whether it can be read as promoting DEI if it's not tied to a specific field or aimed at a particular course. And that's a gray area. But if it's related to a course or a specific field, I don't believe that should be of any. I don't think anyone's going to take notice with that, hopefully.
Yeah. I think we might have a pattern in these subsequent questions too. Are student groups, undergraduate student groups, protected and allowed free speech around these?
Yes, that's outlined in the law.
And what about particular academic courses and their ability to touch on issues around diversity, for example?
Yeah, that would appear to be protected in this law.
Wonderful. Regarding syllabi, many have land acknowledgement statements. Are those still allowed?
And can you clarify what you mean by land acknowledgement statements?
Yeah, these often say that the land on which the course is taking place originally belonged to indigenous people, naming the various tribal nations in sort of paying respect or gesturing towards colonization.
Yeah, I think that's clearly allowed by the law. there could be a gray area if the substance of the class is not related to the particular issue of land acknowledgement.
Yeah. You kind of hinted at this earlier, but what could penalties look like? What do they look like for instructors or staff?
Now, when I look at it, I really didn't see anything that talks about penalties for individuals. It mainly talks about penalties against the school for infractions. And even then, it sets out in the enforcement section that any person that believes that something in this law has been violated, that there's, I guess, on unlawful teaching of DEI or promotion of DEI at one of the 3 state universities, that a person may notify the Attorney General of a violation, and then the Attorney General may bring an action against the institution, seeking a writ of mandamus to compel the institutional leaders to comply with the law. Now, it's easier said than done for some of the problems that people are observing with the law, because in Iowa, in order to get a mandamus, it has to be pretty clear that there's a duty that has to be enforced, and it's up in the air whether a court will enforce someone to not promote a particular widely contested opinion. It gets back to, the void for vagueness argument. Will a court even know what the plaintiff is talking about? And so I think there's going to be compliance issues. Yes.
Yeah, and I foresee those coming. I wonder, Iowa Board of Regents member David Barker in early November urged university presidents in Iowa to ensure that universities, quote, follow the spirit of the law, not find ways around it. In your opinion, what is the spirit of laws like SF 2435?
Well, and nothing against Mr. Is it Barker?
Right.
Yeah, nothing against Mr. Barker. I don't know him. I'm sure he's a fine person, but that's probably not a very patriotic statement to make. And the spirit of the law, I guess it depends upon who you talk to. If you ask, one set of citizens, the spirit of the law is to dismantle 60 years of civil rights progress. If you ask another group of citizens, it may be something entirely different. And I'm not sure we can reach consensus on what the spirit of law is. And I'm not sure we even need to. Or, I don't think a person can be disciplined for not following the spirit of the law. We live in a nation, we're a nation of it's said we're a nation of laws, not men. And so we don't really hold people accountable for not going back and seeing what was in someone's mind when a law was passed. We generally require in this nation that a law be written down, and we go by the words that are written. So I don't know what he's talking about, but that seems to be against our system of jurisprudence.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer. Students reached out to us and are worried about not only the current legislation, SF 2435, for example, but proposed legislation like HSB 53, and what that might mean for accreditation and their freedom of speech on campus. Are there specific programs that risk losing accreditation, like those with codes of ethics that touch on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And then another part to that, should students feel free to initiate questions and discussions around privilege and power, for example, in their classes?
Well, another good question. I guess it depends upon the, and correct me if I pronounce this incorrectly, the accrediting entity. Since 1960s, the schools have recognized the educational benefits that flow from diverse student bodies. I mean, if you look at the most recent affirmative action cases, student for fair admissions versus Harvard and North Carolina, while striking down the particular system in place at those schools, the court still held to the belief that there are benefits that flow from diversity, from having a diverse student body. It states that it improves cross-racial understanding, helps break down racial stereotypes, and enables students to better understand persons of different races, better prepares students for an increasingly diverse society. And the cases also talk about the benefits of preparing our nation's leaders to better be able to live in a multi-diverse society and to improve confidence in government operations. So those are still valid interests on a campus. And so an accrediting institution may still require some diversity, equity, and inclusion measures for a school to pass their certifications. Only time will tell, who will give in on that issue, whether the organizations will change or whether the law would change, whether the enforcement of the law would change. Now, some of these laws, and I don't recall seeing it in this law, I may have looked over it, but some laws specifically in other states set out that, none of the above language, quote unquote, is meant to interfere with the accrediting process. But who knows?
Yeah, the future is certainly unwritten. A couple more questions. This next one is more of an ethics question than, say, a legally minded one. But are there laws that you can see in history or today that were so or are so unethical that they're not worth following? I'm wondering, if we look at the past, those laws that mandated a segregated society, how did people of conscience view them? How might we view these laws today?
All right. And so, once again, I can't really give a legal advice, and I'm ethically precluded from giving legal advice or even advocating for the breaking of any laws. But I will say that I think each individual must search their conscience, their individual circumstances, and the consequences of any potential actions, and see how they want to govern themselves. It really comes down to the individual. Now, and I will say, to answer your question, yeah, our history is replete. If you're getting at civil disobedience, our history is replete with civil disobedient actions that have led to meaningful change. I mean, you can, you get the Boston Tea Party. You have the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. And since this is Black History Month, I did get some excerpts from Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail. If it may not bore people, or if you might give me the courtesy of reading a few paragraphs. Okay.
Please.
Because I still think his letter from Birmingham jail, at least for my generation, when you talk about civil disobedience, everyone says, oh, read his letter. And if you're familiar with King, he even said, before you even go into a non-violent campaign, that there was 4 steps he recommended. Collection of the facts, know what you're talking about to determine whether injustices actually exist. And then second, you negotiate with the person that may be responsible for some of these injustices to see if on their, if they'll take the moral high ground and just change their behavior. And then he said the third step was, self-purification, to examine yourself to see if this is the only option, if you're contributing to the problem, this kind of self-purification kind of thing. And then upon those, and then he said direct action. And one of the things that he promoted, of course, was nonviolence, but he did promote civil disobedience. And in fact, he was in that Birmingham jail because of an act of civil disobedience, which was just, demonstrated without a permit. But he said that he was probably going to do it when he get out. And just to give some excerpts, he says, one may want to ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are 2 types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. An unjust law is no law at all. Now, he does say that you must be willing to suffer the consequences. And he, but I like this quote too. This gets back to why he was in jail. And he states that sometimes a law is just on its face and unjust in its application. For instance, I have been arrested on a charge of parading without a permit. Now, there is nothing wrong in having an ordinance which requires a permit for a parade, but such an ordinance becomes unjust when it is used to maintain segregation and to deny citizens the First Amendment privilege of peaceful assembly and protest. He implores people, and I hope you are able to face the distinction I'm trying to point out. In no sense do I advocate evading or defying the law, as this would lead to rabid segregation. That would lead to anarchy. One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks the law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustices is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. And that's Dr. Martin Luther King, and I want to thank you for giving me my Black History moment.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think those words are incredibly relevant today. Thank you so much for drawing from that letter. I am curious too, if and when people have confusion or are wanting clarification about how the law applies to their particular role, where might they turn? Do you have any suggestions on that?
Well, yeah, I think the best advice for anyone facing these kind of issues is to consult with an attorney that's competent in the area. I think an employee or contractor, people may say you also may want to review the institutional rules and regulations. If you have a letter of acceptance or a letter of appointment, any faculty handbooks, and even if you belong to a union, of course, a collective bargaining agreement. But the first step, if you feel that your rights are being infringed upon, is to consult an attorney.
Yeah,
knowledgeable in the area.
Mr. Hamilton, thank you so much for your insights and your time. I think it will be really helpful. It's been helpful to me. I think it will be helpful to a lot of people.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this undertaking.
Finally, we'll hear a few words from Courtland Cox, who will weigh in on Iowa's recent laws. Courtland Cox is a civil rights movement veteran. At 19, while a student at Howard University, he joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which was the vanguard of the civil rights movement. He participated in local sit-ins, helped organize the 1963 March on Washington, and, along with hundreds of others, took part in the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, registering voters despite segregationist laws. Since the 1960s, he's continued a lifetime of service working with the NAACP, the Zen Education Project, the SNCC Legacy Project, and many other organizations. His lifetime of work exemplifies what Ella Baker said, that we who believe in freedom cannot rest. Thank you, Mr. Cox, for your lifetime of work and for joining us to weigh in on what's going on in Iowa.
Well, yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Excellent. So, knowing your perspective, one shaped by your work with SNCC, how do you view laws today, like those banning DEI programs, topics, and practices?
Well, it's interesting. The way I view it is it's not new. I've seen this before, and it's really the effort by a minority group of people, and mainly white males of high net worth, to make sure that people of color, women, and people who are LGBTQ and are not like them in that sense are relegated to second-class citizenship. And so we've seen this before. So, I mean, for example, when I was coming up in the 1960s, if a woman wanted to get a loan, she would have to have her husband sign for it. If a woman wanted to become a doctor, she was told that, in fact, why are you doing this? You're taking the place of a man. So the sense is really, it's a program that's being revisited. I mean, one of the things that we really have to look at and really focus on it, in terms of me, the most dangerous conversation is the word in this conversation is, again, MAGA, again, because they want to revisit what was happening 60, 65 years ago. And so that it failed then because people who were being placed and talked about as second-class citizens organized in such a way over time to make a difference. So they even recognize the change. So as we look at this whole question of DEI, it's not new. We need to understand it. We need not to be overwhelmed by it. We need to not be paralyzed by it. We need to create our own belief system that we begin to put in place.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And one sort of similar question, in light of the work that you and others have done, how can we honor that? What's obligated of us today, especially those of us in schools and universities?
Well, I think, first of all, is continue the fight. I think the most important thing is for the people at universities and colleges and the communities have to understand that they're deeply connected to what happened in the 1960s. They're a beneficiary of it, and what happened in the 1960s and the 1970s, and what people have been, fought for. But also now they have to protect the gains that they made. So my sense is that, people could say that we are not going to have diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, and what we have when we say that is what we have is real ignorance. When you really look at not only the people who are espousing this and the people who are now being placed in cabinet positions, I mean, the word ignorance is probably the most, the word that deals with, because the world is about diversity. The world is about equality. It is inclusion, whether you're talking about the number of things that are alive, the number of plants that exist, the way people think, the number of languages, the music, all that. What makes up the world is diversity. You can't create something that is counter to diversity because it's a natural phenomenon. And if you're talking about equality, this country was founded on the whole question of the Declaration of Independence, where in fact we're talking about that all people are created equal and, endowed by their creator, with certain inalienable rights. And then, so inclusion, the question of empathy. So one of the things, and the most important thing that I think people can have at this point, young people can have at this point, is a belief system. A belief system that says that at the end of the day, one, that all persons are created equal, and that there are nobody who is going to be more equal than others. That is what Ella Baker taught us. That is what the Declaration of Independence taught us. That's what others who fought in all of these fights that we've had over time have taught us. And so the most important thing is have a belief system, even though you think it's darkest now, that you cannot be paralyzed by what they're doing, because what is most important is not your reaction to them, is first of all creating a new reality for us, because that's what we did in the 1960s. What we created was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. We created the Lowndes County Organization. We created bookstores. We created a number of things that says, we are now going to create our reality and the world we think it should be in. So I think the more energy we spent on building the world that we want, and not just being overwhelmed by what they say, because they say everything every day. I mean, so if you keep chasing down these rabbit holes, you're wasting time. What is it you want? Take the time, take the energy to build what you want, and begin to understand that we have seen this movie before. They were defeated before, and they'll be defeated again. So that people have to believe, young people have to believe that can happen. But the other thing about young people, and I'm accusing myself of that, is that one thing about young people is that we think because we believe it should happen immediately. That is not going to be the case. You need to take the time to talk to others in your age group. You need to take the time to talk to your parents. You need to take the time to talk to your neighbors. You need to take the time to talk to people who you don't usually talk to build a community and build a different reality. So that is one of the things that young people need to learn, is at the end of the day, it's going to take some time, but if you have a belief system that you will win, you will win.
Absolutely. I can't think of a better message. Thank you so very much.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, the potential for next steps is unlimited, but requires community, learning, and action. So community, get involved with people around you. We need one another. Any of the groups sponsoring this organization would welcome your involvement. The first lie of fascism is its inevitability, and collaborating with people in your area can provide an antidote of hope. At UNI, their faculty labor union is United Faculty. More generally, there's the AAUP, that's the American Association of University Professors. At Iowa State and the U of Iowa, there's informal faculty communities that you can find and join. Also at U Iowa, there's UE Local 896, that's the Graduate Labor Union, COGS, or student groups like the Cross-Cultural Student Alliance or the Latino or Black Student Unions. While this webinar has been aimed at higher ed, there are ways to get involved in K-12 with groups like Public School Strong Initiative by Citizens for Community Improvement, initiatives by the Great Plains Action Society, or student-led groups like CORE in Des Moines and Iowa WTF statewide. There are many organizations and coalitions waiting for your involvement. Learn more about yourself. As we were reminded, Martin Luther King said about laws like we're facing that we should examine our own work to see if we're mitigating or actually contributing to the problem. Toward that end, you might consider joining or hosting a book club. Haymarket, Rethinking Schools, and AK Press are just a few excellent publishers whose work makes clearer the paths forward. One recent book worth highlighting is Jesse Hagopian's Teach Truth, The Struggle for Anti-Racist Education. If you're interested in organizing and learning from the past, the SNCC Legacy Project is hosting summer courses on the organizing tradition of the Civil Rights Movement. More information can be found at snclegacyproject.org. That's snclegacyproject.org. We are living through a historic time, and record keeping is important, regardless of whether it immediately changes minds. Towards that end, public comments on upcoming bills, publishing articles or letters to the editors, and backing up resources and sharing them outside the university networks are all ways to do this. When teaching becomes illegal, we can engage in the long tradition of fugitive pedagogy. And stay plugged in. Keep abreast of what's going on with current and proposed legislation and policies. We need to vote, but it's going to take more than voting to end this segregationist thrust. Instead of being complicit at work, ask questions when higher-ups demand over compliance. Start and continue intentionally building community with colleagues. Because this is scary and hard, and there are things that are out of our control. But be like Marie and act with the level of integrity that you can feel good about. To paraphrase Martin Luther King, we have a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws and policies. Thank you so much for tuning in to this webinar.